Okay folks, let's talk about herringbone stitching. Much beloved by reenactors, but is there actually any evidence for it in the Viking Age? Well, yes there is. However, it's herringbone, but not as we know it. Or more accurately, not as we most often use it. So, welcome to my brain folks, we're going down a herringbone rabbit hole. Okay, so if you don't know what type of stitch I'm talking about, it's this one. It'll be somewhere. And we're not talking about herringbone weave in fabric, we're just talking about the herringbone stitch, particularly the decorative stitch used in large, loosely worked versions as a decoration on kit. This diagram shows the basic working of this stitch, where you have diagonals on the right side of the work and then little back steps that are hidden on the underside. And here's one that I stitched earlier. This is a version that I'm happy to use on my Viking Age kit. Eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that this actually worked on the inside of the garment. So in this case, my right side of the work is actually the inside. You can see in this picture how I've got a small turned hem there, and I'm using the herringbone stitches to hold down the edge of that turned hem. And this is what it looks like on the right side of the work. So as you're working, it's actually your wrong side, but when you flip it over, this is what you're left with, two little tiny rows of what look like running stitches. I'm going to talk about these quite a lot more later on in the video. So in modern needlework, we've got a large variety of herringbone stitches which are used and embellished in a huge variety of ways. And I think some of that familiarity has kind of bled into what we do as reenactors. When we see the word herringbone, we run with it. It's easy, particularly when you are first starting out. To see herringbone mentioned in a stitch guide, your brain links to what you see of herringbone everywhere else, or you've seen it on another reenactor's kit, and you go, herringbone, brilliant, tick, in the bank. I certainly did. When I first started, it was like, ooh, pretty, I'm going to do that. However, with a few more years research in the bank, I'm making different choices, and I want to share that with you today. And then you can make your own decision on how you want to use herringbone going forward. I am not making this video to have a go at reenactors who have herringbone on their kit. So much of that work, you can clearly see how much care and time has gone into it, and it's beautiful. However, the examples that we do have look very different. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to look at the actual examples of herringbone and its variants that we have in the archaeological record. Herringbone in the form that is most familiar to us in the modern age is found in the Viking Age, that stitch that I showed you earlier. We have examples from Hedeby, where that stitch was worked over the inside, holding down the turned hem, keeping it firm, so that the two little rows of what look like running stitches are the only thing that's visible on the outside. There is also another example of this finely worked herringbone from 6 to 8 pavement in York. Here is a rather extreme close-up of a diagram of this fragment from Penelope Walton's work, Textiles, Cordage and Raw Fibre from 16 to 22 Coppergate. The herringbone here has been worked along the raw edge, it seems, to prevent fraying. However, if you look at the left-hand side, you can see that further down the hem's actually been turned over and there's stitch holes there. So we're not sure if this herringbone stitch actually continued along into that and was actually worked right on the inside of a seam, which is pretty cool. But either way here, it's being used right at the edge of a garment as part of a hem. If you have a look in the description for this video, there is a link there where you can download this PDF and a lot of other really cool ones as well if you fancy taking a look. As far as I know at the time of recording, these are the only 2 instances of herringbone stitch that we have holding down part of a hem. Now, if you know of any others, please hit me up because I would love to hear about them. But at present, these are the only 2 examples that we have of this more openly worked herringbone stitch. These are not the only types of herringbone, however. More closely worked and tiny examples with no negative space have been found on garments, on hats and on cushions. The Mamman cushion has a really complex version of herringbone stitch laid over a seam, and the entire stitch is only 3mm wide. This is a picture of the original find itself, just here. And on this diagram, where that red arrow is pointing, you can see the seam that the herringbone was worked over, that vertical seam in the middle there. The Skjoldehamn tunic and the shirt both have a version of herringbone stitch that looks very similar to the one found at Mamman. They're both done over the edges of seams, so they're over the place where two pieces of fabric join. It adds an awful lot of strength, as I found out when I was making this one. Often with necklines they'll overlay, but these are two separate pieces that join just along that line, and that's potentially a weak point. If it gets torn or you're pulling it about over your head, that line could split. So it seems quite a sensible place to put a line of reinforcing stitching that just happens to be pretty and looks like a braid from a little way away. This stitch is also found around the neck and around the flap on the shirt, and all that stitching is something that I need to do very soon to get this shirt finished. So if you'd like a video on how to do this stitch while I make this shirt finished, give me a shout. There's an example of another form of herringbone on a hat from Leens in the Netherlands, dated between the 6th and the 9th century, probably leaning towards later 9th. And in this example, the stitch again runs over the seam where two pieces of fabric meet, and it adds a lot of strength and reinforcement. That example has two little tiny rows of stem stitch either side of it as a well, which adds even more structure. The Welsh Viking has a video on making this cap where he shows you the embroidery really close up and gives you lots of lovely other hints and tips, so that's much recommended if you haven't checked that out yet. So, if these are the examples that we actually have, why do we see herringbone being used in quite different ways for reenactment kit? If we've got it on the inside of seams with just the little dots of running stitch showing, or we've got instances where there's this dense braid-like stitch being applied over the edges of seams, why are we seeing it just being used as a simple decoration? And why are we seeing it very big and very blown up? Well, I think there's two reasons really. Firstly, when we see herringbone listed in lists of period stitches, there's often not very much in the way of description of how it was actually used. And it can be a case of us just mentally ticking a box, yep, herringbone's good, we're all good there, and not thinking too much more about it, looking at other reenactors having it on their kit, and not going down the textile rabbit holes that I tend to go down to at 1 o'clock in the morning. Secondly, stitch diagrams. Stitch diagrams are deceptive little whatsits at times because they are designed to blow the stitch up, spread it out to make it easier to learn. And it does, it makes it much easier to see the steps. However, it leaves you with a false impression of what that stitch is actually supposed to look like at the end, which is where digging around and actually trying to find photographs of the extant examples is so helpful. Because if you've heard the word herringbone, and all you've ever seen is our modern versions of herringbone, which are very loosely and openly worked and quite large, then you're going to have that impression in your mind. However, if you've looked at this or this, you're starting from a very different perspective. So having said all that, what are some of the ways that we can use herringbone in our kit and be really happy that they're well evidenced? Firstly, do use teeny tiny, finely worked herringbone stitches on the inside of your hems, covering that seam line. So all you have when you turn the work to the right side is the two little parallel lines of running stitches going along. Absolutely perfect, well evidenced, lovely. Do use the extremely closely worked variants of herringbone that don't leave any negative space, the ones that look like a braid. These do take a while to work up, but they are incredibly strong and they really do reinforce those seam lines very well. So we've got evidence for them used on necklines, we've got evidence for them used on pillbox caps. I think you can safely extrapolate from that to other headwear, things that are going to take a lot of force, and use that sensibly on clothes where it's culturally appropriate. It's also plausible to use these stitches right along the edge of a hem. so that you're basically encasing the raw edge with either side of the stitch. Personally, I think I'd probably choose to add a braid because it's more easy to replace should it wear out or come loose, but that's up to you. That is a plausible use for this stitch. Avoid using widely spaced, large herringbone stitches purely as decoration, especially if it's not covering a seam or a hem at all. If you really want to use herringbone on the outside of your work, use very small, finely spaced stitches, use appropriate thread. Silk could be an option for a high status kit. Stick to your hem or seam lines, perhaps use it to cover the whip stitches that you've used to secure your hem down. It really won't do an awful lot for a hem the wrong way round. When it's used with the crossed parts of the stitches facing outwards away from the hem, it loses that function of holding that hem flat. Don't go crazy, don't make it too big, keep it nicely small and nicely worked. The one caveat to using it as decoration would be if you were using it as part of an embroidery piece, so on a piece that's on a separate piece of cloth that's then later added to your clothing, so it's easy to remove for washing or easier to remove if you're handing down your tunic to an underling, for example. So say you have a later Anglo-Saxon character, mid-high or high status, and you want to use an embroidery design. Now, in this case, I don't really know where herringbone fits into that. I don't have the knowledge for that. It's not an area that I have gone on a deep dive into. So I would suggest speaking to your authenticity team, if you have one, or finding somebody who really knows their way around embroidery before beginning a piece. It's basically mysterious wizardry to me. I'm still very much learning on more complex embroidery. We have a tendency to think in quite modern terms about trim. We want it to be really bright, really obvious. That's interesting to us. However, the aesthetics in the Viking Age and the limitations in time and money to make such trims were very different. Most clothing wasn't decorated, not with anything extravagant anyway. The decoration that there was tended to be functional as well as beautiful. When you're looking at around 40 days, that's 10-hour days of doing nothing but fibre preparation, spinning, weaving, sewing. 40 days for one garment. The argument that, oh, there was long winter nights in which to embellish things to a great degree kind of falls down. Because keeping a family clothed or an estate clothed was a full-time job. And that cloth was extremely precious, so you're going to look after it. So you can see why it might be that a lot of what we find is functional as well as decorative. It's not just there to look pretty in most cases. The exception would be extremely high status kit. We're talking kings and queens here, because their whole thing was to show their wealth, to show their power, to have frivolous decoration. And the highest members of society would try to copy that. But for most of us, especially when we're first getting started, we want basic kit, we want strong kit, we want strong kit that's going to last. And that is where herringbone can be exceedingly useful if used in the right way. There's a wide variety of options for adding strength and prettiness to your kit. You can use tablet braid, you can use finger braids or cords along the very edges of garments, use contrasting fabric trims and particularly trims of silk for higher status kit. Oh, lovely. So I'd encourage you to delve a little bit deeper into those because there's so many options and they are glorious. And that's it. Herringbone stitch rant over. If you would like a video on how to do some of these herringbone stitches a little bit more in depth or some deep dives into the other ways that we can strengthen and decorate our kit, let me know in the comments. If you have any other evidence for herringbone in the Viking Age, hit me up, link me, I'll be very, very grateful. Same if you are somebody who knows a lot about Anglo-Saxon embroidery, please do comment and let people know how herringbone can be used in that context. It may be lots, it may be not at all, but I'd love to know more about that myself as well. So yay! All the things in the brain, not enough space, oh no. Okay, this really is the end now. Thank you everybody so much for being here and for watching. I hope you have an absolutely fabulous day and I will see you soon.